Welcome everyone to the third day and the third panel in our week-long effort to reimagine the internet. We're thrilled that you're joining us today, and I hope we have a lot of folks who were with us for the first 2 days. Today, we're gonna have a conversation about one possible avenue for promoting competition in the social media market and perhaps addressing some of the pathologies in online discourse. And we'll be talking about interoperability. The idea that the walled gardens of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter might be healthier if they were forced open so that their competitors, or perhaps just their would-be but unwelcome collaborators, could interoperate. And this idea will be familiar to those of you who were on the internet a decade or two ago, when the predominant means of communicating were open and interoperable. Some of the protocols still remain, of course. Oh, I'm getting a message that someone can't hear me. Am I coming through now? Is the audio coming through or no? Okay.
Looks like a lot of people can.
Looks like it's working. So I'm going to continue. So the idea of interoperability harkens back to these early days of the internet, and some of the protocols used primarily to communicate then still remain. Think of email, a bit of a modern day miracle that anyone today can sign up for an email service with any company, or even set up their own email server and send an email to anyone else around the world. And it will just work because email services respect the same open and interoperable standard for sending and receiving emails. Our task today is to ask whether it would be possible and whether it would be desirable for social media to work the same way. What if we returned to a world of protocols, not platforms, as Mike Masnick put it in a paper he authored for the Knight Institute? What if you could sign up for an account with NPR that would rank your social media newsfeed according to journalistic standards or to the public interest rather than to engagement? What if your local community could establish its own social network with features responsive to your needs, but that would still allow you to talk to friends on the other major networks? Would this in fact improve competition in the market? Would it improve public discourse? Would it empower local communities and enable local governance? And perhaps most importantly, at least at the threshold, is any of this even technically or legally possible? Those are the questions that we'll be discussing today, and I'm delighted to be joined by two of my favorite internet intellectuals to dig into these questions. And Corey and Daphne, you can use it on your Twitter bio if you want. First up, we'll have Cory Doctorow. Cory is a science fiction author, activist, and journalist. I'm sure he needs no introduction to most of you here. He works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's an MIT Media Lab research affiliate, a visiting professor of computer science at the Open University, and a visiting professor of practice at the University of North Carolina School of Library and Information Science. And he co-founded the UK's Open Rights Group. And after Cory, we'll hear from Daphne Keller. Daphne is a legal scholar and the director of intermediary liability at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. She was formerly associate general counsel to Google, and she's one of the most prolific and insightful writers about the challenges of regulating social media. If you're on Twitter and care about these issues, and I'm sure you've come across Daphne's extraordinary threads. While they're talking, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A. The chat, I believe, will be closed during the actual presentations, but the Q&A will be open. We'll open the chat back up afterward, and I'll be monitoring the questions, and I'll inject them as we go along in the conversation afterwards. So first up, Cory.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for everyone who's attending, and thanks to the Knight Center for having us. I want to start by talking about why I think competition is important here. And it's different, I think, from the kind of axiomatic reason that we say, well, competition might solve our problems. I don't favor competition because it makes markets efficient. I don't favor competition because it enhances consumer choice in that kind of trivial, I'd like it purple and not blue sense. I favor competition because I favor self-determination, the right to live your life the way that you want to, the right to exercise the judgment that you have about your immediate circumstances that other people don't have, whether that's product designers sitting in potentially your distant past, making choices about how your product should work, or moderators or executives operating in real time and trying to make those calls. That ultimately we ourselves are best situated to know what kind of rules we should follow. And the problems of self-determination run up against the problems of content moderation. The norms and the barriers and the register that people want to speak in and the way that they would like to be addressed are incredibly variable and context dependent. And, while it may be true that Facebook or Twitter have structures that make them unsuited to being the final arbiter of those judgment calls about the lives of, in the case of Twitter, hundreds of millions of users, or in the case of Facebook, billions of users, I also think that it's unlikely that anyone is situated to make those ultimate calls. That ultimately you want users themselves, either individually or in communities, to be able to make the decision about what they see, what they don't see, how it's ordered, what the rules of the road are for discourse, and so on. So while it's true that there are users who are defended by the content moderation policies of the platforms, there are probably people who face harassment who benefit from Facebook's real names policy because their harassers don't want to have their real names. There are also users who are exposed to bad conduct as a result of that kind of paternalistic model where someone else gets to make the call for you. There are people who fear harassment and are forced to use their real names and who run up against it. And ultimately, I think that the right place to decide what is and isn't the barriers to our privacy, or the minimum standard for our privacy, is not in Facebook's corporate boardrooms, not even in a kind of notional Facebook that is pro-privacy. I want the decisions about what the minimum standards for privacy are to be made in a democratically accountable governance forum, preferably a legislature. I want individuals to have private rights of action to enforce their privacy rights rather than depending on attorneys general or district attorneys to bring cases on their behalf, and so on. That ultimately what we need in terms of standards about privacy and harassment and other bad conduct, those minimum standards should be set democratically and not by even the best tech executives we can imagine, who are far from the tech executives we have today. Now, it seems to me that if we had lots of federated platforms, that individuals and communities could make those calls. Now, not every individual is capable of designing their own rival platform or even hosting their own rival platform that plugs into one of the existing ones. But I do think that the history, particularly of marginalized groups using the internet, tells us that there are lots of toolsmiths who would like to serve those groups, including members of those groups. And that the thing that we decry often about technology, that it's a force multiplier for the individual choices of a coder who can make some code and then project it over millions of users, is also the potential benefit that if there's a toolsmith who suits your needs, who's a volunteer or whom you can afford to hire or who is among your group, then that toolsmith can provide you with a platform where you can set your house rules and you can maintain that platform as well. But there's a problem that we run up against if we imagine that kind of pluralism. If we imagine a reversion to the internet that we once had before it all turned into what Tom Eastman calls 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, and that's that there are these powerful network effects that drive people to join dominant platforms. Facebook, every time someone joins Facebook, it's a reason for someone else to join Facebook because they want to talk to that person. And ultimately these network effects turn into a kind of mutual hostage taking, where I'm on Facebook because you are, and you're on Facebook because I am. Neither of us would be there if both of us could leave. And in theory we could have this kind of international everybody leaves Facebook day, where we organize that next Wednesday at 3 p.m. we all resign our accounts and go somewhere else and reconstruct our social graphs. But that kind of collective action problem is not historically precedented. It's not really how we get from one dominant platform to another. Instead, what we see usually is the subsumption of one platform into another through interoperability, where a platform opens a little portal to another platform, users use that other platform, gradually users trickle over, and as they trickle over, eventually that first platform becomes less important and ultimately gets swallowed up by something new. We had Lexmark sue Static Controls in the early 2000s for making printer cartridges that worked in Lexmark printers. Today, Lexmark is a division of Static Controls, right? That's one of the paths that we've seen historically. And I think that the lesson we can learn from that historic pattern is that we tend to over determine the role of network effects and underappreciate the role of switching costs. That if the switching costs are low, right? Like if you can leave Facebook without leaving your friends behind because you can go to another platform that has better policies, then the fact that Facebook isn't where you want to be, but it's where you have to be, ceases to matter. In fact, Facebook's walled garden ceases to be a walled garden. It becomes a kind of all you can eat buffet for would-be Facebook competitors who can turn up and find all the Facebook groups called I hate Facebook and I wish I could leave, and drop a message in saying you can leave Facebook today using my service and still stay in touch with all your Facebook friends. Now, there are many proposals to make Facebook and other dominant platforms interoperable. We see mandates. So in the 2020 Access Act from Senator Warner, we see an idea that we would have a mandate that would require Facebook to expose certain APIs. Warner has this very canny insight, which is that Facebook already has these interoperability APIs that it uses to meld Instagram and WhatsApp, these subsidiaries that it acquired through anti-competitive mergers, and that these APIs are likely to be as good as an API can be because there's no reason for Facebook to subvert those APIs. It like its business priorities are aligned with making those APIs robust and full featured. And so Warner says, let's make them expose those APIs, and we'll create a layer of fiduciaries. We'll create a layer of like trusted third parties who will sit between Facebook and would-be interoperators and make judgment calls about whether or not the would-be interoperator is going to toe the line, whether they're going to be good for users or bad for users, whether they're another Cambridge Analytica, or whether they're, say, NYU's engineering school wanting to open up a portal to Facebook so they can monitor its political ads and make sure they're not secretly engaged in paid political disinformation, which is the thing NYU's engineering school does now, but Facebook is threatening to sue them over it. And these fiduciaries, these trusted third parties, they're a kind of unwieldy answer to a lot of internet problems. You know, at EFF, I've lost track of the number of times people have shown up at EFF and said, "Look, we've got a solution for the internet. What we do is we ask EFF to divide the entire internet into the good internet and the bad internet, and then you can sign the good internet. We'll make it happen." Right? There's lots of spam fighters and the trusted computing people in 2002, you know, who've been making these proposals forever. And you know, the solution to the internet that starts with one, find someone with infallible judgment, two, put them in charge, it's not great, but at least these fiduciaries are like regulated entities, that they're not just someone who appoints themselves god king. You know, we already have the fiduciary who decides who can use Facebook. That fiduciary's name is Mark Zuckerberg. He's a very bad fiduciary, and so we might be able to replace him with someone who's a little more accountable. In the European Union, the DMA and the DSA contemplate less robust degrees of interoperability. The Competition and Markets Report out of the UK has little bits and pieces of this, although they also fall short of even Warner's mark. But imagine that we had these mandatory interfaces. It still poses another problem, right? It doesn't solve the problem because Facebook is not incentivized to maintain those interfaces as robust ways to compete with Facebook. In fact, Facebook's first choice is that nobody would compete with Facebook. I think that anyone from Facebook who shows up and says, no, 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 we welcome all competition, we hope that if we're not the best service out there, someone else takes over from us, should be treated with enormous skepticism. That's not the way most firms operate. And it's really not the way Facebook has historically operated. Just look at Mark Zuckerberg's memos to his CFO when he acquired Instagram and said basically, hey, it looks like Instagram is better than we are. We should buy them so people can't leave us and end up over there, right? Um, and so there is this possibility that Facebook would subvert the mandate, that although these APIs are really powerful today, or presumptively powerful, only Facebook really knows how well they work on their backends, that they might not be tomorrow, that you could imagine a different way of constructing those data flows so that Facebook could keep Instagram integrated with it, but would aggregate those federated services that join Facebook. And there's precedent for this too. You know, back in 2012, the voters of Massachusetts passed a ballot initiative with an overwhelming majority to force the automakers to allow independent mechanics to read the diagnostic information off of the wired networks inside of cars, the CAN bus. The automakers had been subverting the CAN bus. They'd been moving that data into encrypted forms and generally making it low quality so that it was harder to get your car fixed in an independent mechanic, and you could be corralled into getting your car fixed by the automakers who can monopolize the service, charge you above the odds for it. And most importantly, and maybe least appreciated in these right to repair questions, the automakers could decide when your car was unfixable, had to be retired, and you would have to buy a new car from them. And so the Bay Staters, they voted for this. The automakers had to accede to it. There were some challenges, but eventually they said, fine, we will expose our wired interfaces, and we're also going to retool our cars so that all the good stuff happens on the wireless interface. And that's not covered by the mandate. And it wasn't. And it wasn't until this year, or last year, 2020, that we got a new ballot initiative with another commanding majority that forced them to expose that wireless interface as well, because subversion is fast. Market-based subversion is fast. They can retool for next year, but regulation is slow. It takes a long time for lawmakers to investigate what's going on, do the fact-finding, hear the appeals, and finally decide that they're going to do something to address that subversion. So even if we could imagine a kind of optimal solution where Facebook was forced to expose these interfaces, where we had a robust privacy law and anti-harassment law that determined the contours of who could connect to it and what remedies people would have in the event that there was something bad going on there, we still wouldn't have something that was durable. We should expect that it would collapse pretty quickly as Facebook subverted it. So what could we do to make it unsubvertible? What could we do to change the equilibrium so that it was in Facebook's interest not to mess with it? That's where I think adversarial interoperability comes in. That's when you plug one thing into another thing without permission. It's not when you have a mandate to do interoperability, you follow a standard. It's when someone just figures out how to plug something into your service, like when Steve Jobs paid some engineers to reverse engineer Microsoft Office so he could make iWork Suite, so that you didn't have to give up your Mac in order to read the documents that came from your friends who used Windows, and you didn't have to use Microsoft's version of Office for the Mac, which was the most cursed piece of software Microsoft ever produced, where if you were dumb enough to open a document with it and then save it again, no one would ever be able to read it again, including you. And so that adversarial interoperability, or at EFF we call that ComCom, competitive compatibility, because it's very hard for people to pronounce adversarial interoperability. Particularly our friends in Germany really struggle with it. Listening to Germans try to say adversarial interoperability is like listening to Germans try to say the word squirrel. It's funny for a little while, and then it makes you feel bad about yourself. So now we say ComCom, or competitive compatibility. And competitive compatibility shifts the equilibrium. Imagine if there was a right for competitors of the automakers to reverse engineer the messages that went over that wireless bus as soon as the automakers switched to the wireless. Imagine if they were shielded from liability under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, trade secrecy rules, Massachusetts' very infamous non-compete rules, and so on, so that they could just reverse engineer it and make an interoperable product. Well, this would plunge the automakers into a kind of never-ending, unquantifiable guerrilla warfare, where they would have to retool and retool again to exclude subsequent versions of this tool. Every time they did it, they would mess up their own mechanics. Their customers who go to the mechanics would blame the automakers for having messed with this tool. You know, halfway through their repair, it stops working, and the mechanics would be sure to let them know who was responsible for it. And ultimately, what could end up happening is that tool, which might be made by a couple of smart MIT kids, would end up creating a secondary market, not just for repair, but for diagnostic tools and for full service that would make the automakers themselves less central to the maintenance of their own cars than they are today. And that could also be the thing that stays Facebook's hand. If the thing that Facebook had to confront if they broke a mandatory API was that suddenly there were bots and scrapers and reverse engineers who were working on allowing the users who'd left Facebook and wanted to talk to their friends to maintain those connections, Facebook would face unquantifiable risk. Now, I'm going to wrap up here because I want to hear from Daphne, but I'm going to say briefly how I think we could get to that limitation of liability. We don't have to reform all of those laws, although I think we should reform all of those laws to get there. You could imagine lots of other things. Like you could imagine that, for example, Facebook is facing antitrust investigations today. Those antitrust investigations will almost certainly end in a settlement. One of the things settlements can do is impose a special master who says, look, if you ever want to invoke copyrights, anti-circumvention clauses, or cybersecurity law, or any of these other regimes that are used to block interoperability and undermine competition, you can do it, but the special master has to sign off on it to make sure that you're not deploying these laws in anti-competitive ways. And again, you insert a measure of democratic accountability into the service. So I think this is how we get a robust system where we have the quantifiable risk that Facebook faces, which is exposing those APIs and taking their lumps and competing, and the unquantifiable risk of guerrilla warfare that just pisses off their users and absorbs ever larger amounts of their engineering talent to no good purpose, that only forestalls the moment at which the regulator catches up with them and makes them stop doing it anyway. And that if we do this, we can lower the switching costs. And when we lower the switching costs, we neutralize the network effects. And when we neutralize the network effects, we can create the self-determination that I think all of us want. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Corey. And Daphne.
Thank you, Corey. That was exciting, as is often the case when you speak. So let me start by saying I want to believe in competitive compatibility. I want even more to believe in adversarial interoperability, because I like the term better. And I want to believe in what a smart person involved in this event described to me as a plethora of social networks accessed by tools that let people interact with multiple networks, including existing and small ones. That is a great future. And I especially want to believe that there's a way for different communities to set and enforce different rules for speech and for what kind of communications are permitted in a particular service, because that would solve a lot of problems in the area where I work, which is on the regulation of internet platforms. And there are a bunch of smart people here, and yeah, maybe we can figure this out. And if you guys tell me that we can get the technology right so this will work, and if you tell me that we can get the money right so that there are people with incentives to do the right things to bring this system into being, I will go with you and try to get the law right, which is the kind of thing that I do for a living. But I see hurdles. So I'm going to talk to you first about the legal problems that I think adversarial interoperability or competitive compatibility can solve, and why it's so important. Although you already know like 2/3 of that from Corey, but I'll try to say other reasons. But I'm also going to talk about the problems that we have to solve first in order to get there. And just to preview those things, because I think I might run out of time and not go into the details much, and then we can talk about them in the Q&A or not. But to preview the hurdles, it's not just that we need to fix problems with the CFAA and with the DMCA anti-circumvention provisions, and all the other things that get in the way of scraping, state CFAA equivalents, trespass to chattels, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely agree we need to fix those. But there are also really tricky questions about privacy that I think haven't been solved yet in the proposals that we've seen to date. And then there are really tricky questions about how to make distributed content moderation work in practice. And this is where the money part comes in, because unless we can build in some kind of efficiencies so that thinly staffed operations can do real world content moderation, that will be a real barrier to getting this to work. Okay, so the vision, the problems that this might solve, there's a big set of problems over in the area of online speech where Alex and I and many, many other people work, where right now there's a lot of wishful thinking that if we just yelled at Facebook enough, it would adopt the right rules for speech. Or that if we just pass the right laws, then all of the problems with harmful content and illegal content and misleading content on the internet would go away. I think you can tell already that I think that's delusional. It's delusional as just a social human matter. We're not going to agree on what the rules are, and then Facebook imposes them and we're all happy. But they're also doomed as a legal matter. And there are two First Amendment problems here. The first is, if what we want is for platforms to take down a bunch of things like hate speech, disinformation, misleading medical advice, pro-suicide content, racial slurs, like awful stuff, that is nonetheless protected by the First Amendment, then there's nothing you can do using the law to make that happen. And that sort of gets in the way of a lot of proposals that mostly Democrats want to advocate for. Generally, I think actually this whole issue is less partisan than it's made out to be. But we can't make the bad content go away using the law. If, on the other hand, what we want is to stop powerful gatekeepers from controlling public discourse and potentially exercising political bias and like removing important voices from the conversation, if you want to stop that, you kind of can't use the law for that either, because you run into a problem where the platforms themselves have First Amendment rights to act as editors and decide what to take down. And so there are barriers in every direction, almost regardless of which theory of the speech problem on the internet you are starting with. But if instead you don't start by telling platforms what to do with speech and what user content to take down and leave up, and you instead say, this is a change in the competition obligations, and you have to open up to the adversarial interoperability or competitive compatibility or any of these things to Mike Masnick's protocols, not platforms model. That's pretty interesting, because then it's not Congress saying something about what speech is and is not permitted. It might get us around a lot of these First Amendment barriers and lead to, I think, a better outcome than you would get, if we could circumvent those First Amendment barriers by actually having a diverse array of editors, having a multiplicity of communities with different rules for speech, and no one or four or five gatekeepers having such tremendous power over public discourse in the ways that they do today. And so it's that sort of vision of a way forward that solves a lot of these speech problems and the competition problems that makes me really excited about this conversation. And the way I envision it, and again, because I'm focused on the speech issues, is what Corey called an all-you-can-eat buffet for competitors, where Google or Facebook opens up access to an uncurated version of its service. So either all of the user-generated content, or Facebook or Google takes down the stuff they know is illegal, and then everything else is left there available for competitors to come along and curate and offer their own version. So you could subscribe to a G-rated version of Twitter from Disney, or a racial justice oriented lens on YouTube from a Black Lives Matter affiliated group. You can envision a lot of possibilities here. Maybe you can have an interface where you merge content from Twitter and content from YouTube, as Power Ventures was trying to do before they fell to a CFAA claim from Facebook. This is a really compelling vision, and that as a legal approach is broadly analogous to things that we've done in telecommunications. Unbundling requirements is the sort of name for inserting competition into markets that are subject to network effects by requiring the incumbents to license out the hard to duplicate resources to newcomers. And here the hard to duplicate resource is us. It's us and our social graphs and all of the content that we've generated that is this sort of dragon's hoard that the incumbents are sitting on. So when I've written about this, I've called it magic APIs. And the reason I called it that initially, first is because I'm used to talking to engineers. It turns out that nobody else likes that term. But I was worried that the technology didn't actually work, that you couldn't have this real-time interoperability where a competitor can run a query across all of Google's corpus of web content over an API. Does that actually work? I don't know. But we have Stephen Wolfram testifying to Congress that he thinks there's a way to make it work. We have Twitter's Project Blue Sky, which is about trying to make it work. So we have technologists who seem to think it's possible. As I always say, I would love to hear what the platform engineers would say if their lawyers weren't listening about what they think is possible. But then the next barrier I worry about that I mentioned before is the getting the money right, because I just don't know. And I think there's a way forward. It's just this isn't my area, and I haven't figured it out or seen somebody else who figured it out. I don't know how to get the financial incentives right, and I also don't know how to get the ad tech piece right. Like how do you restructure where ads go and who makes money? I think that's doable, but I haven't seen the thinking. The two big pieces that I do worry about are as I mentioned before, privacy and the burden on content moderation, the burden of providing content moderation. So I'll talk about the content moderation burden first. We tried something like this back in the 90s for web content. There was something called PICS, and then later the ICRA, the Internet Content Rating Association. And the idea was that as a user, you would tell your browser what kind of content you're willing to see. Female frontal nudity, yes or no. Violence against cartoon animals, yes or no. Pretty granular set of checkboxes. You as a user put that in your browser, and then every webmaster on the internet fills out that same kind of form, and then your browser does or does not access content depending on whether it matches your preferences. And of course, ICRA promptly noticed nobody was going to put in the labor to do this, to label every website on the internet. So then they layered on what Corey is calling fiduciaries, this idea that as a user, you can, in addition to setting your own preferences, you can subscribe to ad lists or block lists from trusted third parties. So you can get, the League of Women Voters or the National Rifle Association, whatever your trusted fiduciary is, as to supplement and tell you what content you do and do not want to see. So ICRA built that, and no one came. There was no magic volunteer labor force to label all of the speech on the internet, even back when there was a whole lot less of it. The kinds of incentives that bring people to Wikipedia or to fund open source projects didn't exist there, and I think won't exist now just because of the incredible scale of trying to assess and judge all of our speech, right? That's the root problem of a lot of this stuff. One piece of a possible solution going forward now, we fast forward to the present, could there be a system where, let me back up. If every node on a federated network that wants to set its own content moderation policies has to reduplicate the effort of, say, translating a video from Kurdish, or identifying what a piece of slang means in Malaysia, or figuring out the political significance of a particular flag or song, that is not work that every little entity in a distributed network can do. And so the kind of dream that I've heard from a lot of people, but it would cost a lot of money and maybe it doesn't work, is you find some way to have metadata attached to content, or some big database linked to a unique ID for content, where if you are a small entity doing content moderation, you ping that and you get something back that says, oh, this is a song in Kurdish that is anti-Turkey. And then at least you have that much information to apply your own policy about what content you do and don't permit. This is something that lots of content moderators at small platforms would like right now. And it would be amazing if it happened. On the other hand, what we realistically see in collaboration and content moderation between platforms now is a lot of Facebook decides and that flows downstream to everybody else. Things like the GIF-CT database for filtering terrorist content are rightly questioned and criticized as just a possible way that the judgment of major platforms gets disseminated out to everybody else and becomes a source of a monoculture and further dominance of the major platforms on the internet. So I think we need to find a way to solve that content moderation burden question. Maybe we can, but I don't see people doing the work on that yet. On privacy, so I love tearing down the CFAA and the other laws that Corey talked about. And I love the idea of having better privacy laws, period, which we very much need no matter what, but also as part of a way forward for the adversarial interoperability approach. But I think there are problems that aren't solved yet. One is I'll call it the you can't consent for your friends problem. If I want to leave Facebook, I want to leave with my history of interactions with my friends and with the comments they made on my baby pictures. And I want to migrate all of that data with me, but that means either that I'm taking my friends' data to some potentially fly-by-night new third-party service that they would never consent to have their data if they knew about it, or I can't take my friends' data with me, and that makes migrating to the competing platform a lot less appealing. Or maybe I need to get their consent, and so every time somebody migrates away from Facebook, every single one of their friends gets, flooded with dialog boxes asking about consent. I have not seen that problem solved, and I think laws like the Access Act kind of just gloss over it and don't pick a side. I don't think it resolves. I'm hoping Corey has an answer because, like I said, I want to believe. The second privacy issue is what I'll call the public data badly used issue. So a lot of people, including me, start with a assumption that if data is already publicly available on a website, that should be fair game for legitimate kinds of reuse, reuse that doesn't infringe copyright, reuse that doesn't raise some other valid legal problem. But what do we do about Clearview AI? Everything that all the images, of my face and probably of most of your faces that are now in that database being used by police, those were scraped from public websites. And at least at the beginning, they were looking for, I think it was Clearview, one of the biometrics firms was just pulling Creative Commons licensed images, which is this, kind of disturbing shift from Creative Commons licenses being created to get rid of a copyright problem to the flow of information, and then becoming a mechanism that made it easier for a privacy problem to be created by Clearview AI building a biometrics database out of it. So it is very hard to identify what rules we would craft to address the Clearview AI problem. And then the third privacy issue I see is, I'll call it the horses out the barn door problem. If we have interoperability and the idea is that new competitors can come and scoop up data, but then if they do something bad with it, they face liability later on. That sounds good, but what do you do if that new competitor who comes along is actually a pretty bad actor and is not in US jurisdiction? The platform can cut them off, but it's kind of too late. A user can sue them, but they're probably judgment proof, and also it's too late. DOJ could try to prosecute them, but same problem. Are we okay with that risk? And if not, is there some way that we can mitigate it that doesn't involve making the platform police and audit its competitors to make sure they're using the data right? So I think there's a way forward. I want there to be a way forward, but I do think we need like 100 smart privacy and technology experts hammering on this particular piece of the problem. And I'll just note one interesting thing for my fellow old people in the audience who've been around these internet questions for a long time, is that the role that copyright law once played in internet debates as a kind of default reason that you could never share anything has largely been eroded by like good case law and evolutions in standards, but increasingly privacy is playing that role. privacy becomes a reason, particularly under European data protection law, to be a default against sharing personal data without a specific basis, which in many cases is consent by the person whose data it is, or the person about whom the data is. Similarly, Facebook's FTC consent decree, which it reached in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, was the reason, as I understand that it pointed to prevent election researchers at NYU from scraping Facebook. There is this, privacy reason arrived at for really good privacy purposes that had the unintended effect of restricting scraping and productive research. So much like copyright, privacy law here is simultaneously doing really important work to protect real values and getting in the way of things that should be okay, and we haven't figured out how to negotiate that yet. All right. I will close up there because I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I really hope we can chart a way forward because I love this idea. I love that it doesn't run headlong into First Amendment violations or into dictating speech rules for the world. I love it because when I teach this subject, I draw on the board for my students a Venn diagram with 3 interlocking circles. There's competition, privacy, and speech. And there are a million issues at the intersection of 2 of them. And then this one's like right in the middle. It is the sweet spot where every single one of those issues comes up, but maybe every single one of those issues can be resolved in this single like magic Gordian knot cutting moment. So I hope we can figure out how to do that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Daphne. And thank you so much to both of you for just incredibly rich observations. I think we have the battlegrounds laid out before us. We have this compelling affirmative case for interoperability, and we have Daphne, telling us all to just hold on. We have a couple of key objections to talk through. And I want to dig into these and give you each a chance to respond to the other. But before we kind of dig into, I think, the 2 main objections that Daphne rightfully points out that we need to think carefully through, I want to get a better sense from both of you about what problems you think interoperability solves. Corey, your presentation focuses mostly on what you describe as self-determination, the idea that interoperability will result in an internet that better reflects our values or what we want from technology. And Daphne, I thought in your presentation you seem to have a slightly broader premise for what the values of interoperability might solve. And I kind of want to ask about that. Would interoperability solve some of the other problems that this conference, for example, has been focused on and that a lot of other people are focused on when it comes to what you often hear described as the pathologies of online discourse? Would it address in any way the spread of disinformation and misinformation? Would it mitigate the problem of hate and harassment online? Would it make the communities that we find ourselves in online spaces more reflective of the real world rather than these perfectly gerrymandered digital cities that have little resemblance to our own physical communities? Would it do any of those things, or is it primarily, for you, Corey, is it primarily about self-determination? And Daphne, to you, do you think it might do some of those things, or do you have concerns? So I'm hoping you can answer, we can just get that question about why we're talking about interoperability out of the way before we focus more deeply on the challenging questions of content moderation and privacy that Daphne raised. So either one of you want to take that up first?
I'm happy to have Daphne go, or I can speak to it too.
Go for it.
All right. So I think that from a user's perspective, that self-determination is the thing that we get from competition. From a social perspective, competition is counter-monopolistic, right, by definition. Monopolies enjoy a couple of significant advantages. One is that they extract monopoly rents, right? They make more money. That's why investors like monopolies. That's why Peter Thiel says competition is for losers. That's why Warren Buffett says that he'll only invest in businesses that have moats and walls. But excuse me. And I think that when firms have monopoly rents, that can be translated into political power. And when firms are very concentrated, or when industries are very concentrated, that political power can be mobilized without solving thorny collective action problems. That if there's only like 3 companies in an industry, it's just not hard for them to figure out what they all want and to spend in unison to get it. And so I think we end up with these very bad policies that don't reflect some pretty some of the questions about privacy are really hard. Some of them are not, and we don't have rules that address any of them. And the reason, I think, is that every time someone tries, a tsunami of money, buries Washington, D.C. or whatever state house is being contemplated in, and it washes away the proposal, and what's left behind is usually nothing or something that is inadequate in important ways, like CCPA with its lack of a private right of action. So I think that if we can cut the supply lines to monopolists, then we can make it easier to open up policy space to make rules that accord with evidence. And as to this question of disinformation, I think the way that it connects here is that it depends on why you believe we have disinformation. I don't think we have disinformation because tech platforms have figured out how to use big data to create mind control rays that can convince you that vaccines are harmful. I think the thing that big tech does is it takes all the people who have a good reason to believe that the authorities are captive to industry because maybe they lost a loved one to the opioid epidemic and saw that the regulators can't be trusted to discipline and rein in the parochial needs of the industry in service to the public needs of the people they're supposed to be representing. You can find those traumatized people and you can say, hey, you already don't trust the FDA, right? We've already established that they're not acting in your behalf. Maybe they're not acting in your behalf when it comes to vaccines too. And I think that's where the disinformation comes from. And I think the reason that the FDA got it wrong on opioids is because the pharma industry is super concentrated and it has bought its refs. And so if we want the industry to stop being able to buy the refs, we need to take away their money. And the way that we take away their money is by forcing them to compete so that they have less money and there are more actors, and it's harder for them to come to a consensus and harder for them to accomplish their regulatory goals.
Great, Daphne.
So I think it's a really good question about what problem is being solved. And in the speech area, I think the problems being solved are all the ones that have to do with having powerful gatekeepers, a small number of powerful gatekeepers. So for example, if what you want to do is mitigate hateful attacks and harassment against female journalists on Twitter or Jewish journalists on Twitter, or the list goes on and on. This gives you an option to have a version of Twitter where there is somebody more aggressively policing that. If what you're worried about is people of goodwill being swayed by disinformation or misleading information, this gives you an opportunity to have somebody, hopefully that person trusts, or maybe that their kids convince them to trust more than they trust Facebook or YouTube, to come in there and put some labels on things. If what we're worried about is legitimate online voices getting silenced, Facebook deciding to take down the Philando Castile video, things like that, it mitigates that problem too, because it ensures there's still a place where those things can be found and can be broadly disseminated. So I do think it addresses a whole lot of problems. It doesn't address the problem of echo chambers. Like that's the one big exception always, because it makes it even more easy for somebody to opt into the all hate speech all the time or all lies all the time version of social media. But we have that in our ordinary media consumption already. That's not a new problem. So I don't think that piece is enough of a downside to offset all of those other benefits.
So I want to pick up on that last point, Daphne, because we got a question from you. We've gotten great questions in the audience. We've gotten 21 questions so far. Keep them coming, and I'm reading them and trying to insert them as I go. So one of the questions we got goes to this last point that you made about echo chambers and the possibility that interoperability would actually just give us more echo chambers in which to self-sort. And I want to push back on that based on my understanding of what some people argue is the benefit of interoperability. This is just a hypothesis. I don't know what the right answer is. But one thing I've heard said is one reason that we have these echo chambers is because of how monolithic the rules are that control what friends we're connected to and what speech gets heard and what speech is allowed to be said, is allowed to be spoken online. And it's true that if we had, accomplished interoperability and had many different platforms, you might initially sort yourself into, these other groups, but those groups are kind of defined with far less granularity than the de facto groups that Facebook puts you into through its algorithmic prioritization of the content that you see and through its algorithmic recommendation of the friends that you may want to connect with. And that, algorithmic sorting is, I think the argument goes, much more fine-tuned and much more likely to result in what I said earlier, this very perfectly digitally gerrymandered existence that you have online. And if instead the echo chamber you end up in is something defined at a much broader level of generality, for example, the NRA version of your newsfeed or the NPR version of your newsfeed, that's just a less troubling kind of echo chamber. That's the kind of echo chamber we have in regular life. I'm looking outside my windows if I can see these echo chambers. That's the kind of echo chamber we live with, and so at least we understand it. It's not this new one that we're still grappling to understand. Does that argument have any purchase? I mean, I'm curious to hear your response.
So I think that argument, it's like proposing an empirical claim about the problem that I feel like could almost be expressed in some relatively short mathematical formula. Like, is the harm of I'm not really going to try to express the formula, but it is the harm of whatever existing very monolithic echo chamber we're in now from Facebook or Twitter or whatever, greater than the harm of the echo chambers we might wind up in this alternate reality, including the possibility that it will draw us more away from echo chambers because our friends will be, interoperating from their own other places and, sharing information, et cetera. I think it's partly a difference of on the today side, we are trapped in a bubble by Facebook, but there's not, for the most part, like super bad, like hate speech and incitement to violence all the time. For most people, whereas in a world where everybody can migrate to 50 Shades of Parlor, maybe more people can and will go into the actual really bad version of a dangerous echo chamber. And I don't know how to, weight those things in the formula to say which one poses a greater risk.
Corey, any more thoughts on this question of the problems we're trying to solve? Are you moved by Daphne's account that interoperability may improve all the problems that we associate with the power of, with powerful gatekeepers? Oh, you're muted for me anyway.
Pardon, I've got too many buttons that I can press to mute myself, and I always either forget to mute or unmute myself in some critical way. So I think Daphne made a very important point there when she talked about how the First Amendment means that the law can't be used to address certain kinds of speech or conduct. That I think is an underappreciated point, because when we talk about echo chambers and when we talk about private spaces or quasi-private spaces where people say things that are outside of the norm, I think that we need to be explicit about what we mean. So first of all, an echo chamber is not an unmitigated bad thing. As I just put down, as I just put in the chat for this Zoom session, the echo chambers, which is to say private forums where people have disfavored views can gather without being exposed to the mainstream view that runs counter to it, aren't just how you organize racist rallies in Charlottesville. They're how people who think that like Black Lives Matter find a place to talk to each other, or people who think that gender is not a binary find a place to talk to each other. The way that we got from a world where within living memory it was illegal to smoke weed or marry someone of a different so-called race or to be gay to this world was by having echo chambers, right? By having private spaces where people with disfavored views could talk to one another, make common cause and emerge. And when we say we don't want disinformation or we don't want medical disinformation or whatever, we have to be really clear what we mean by that. Do we mean that we want the social norm to be that if you show up and say, hey, everybody, we should torch the Capitol and hang Mike Pence, that the people around you say, you're a bad person, you're not welcome at my home anymore, go away, no one wants to hire you anymore, whatever. That's one thing, right? If what we mean is we don't want people who are sitting around a poker game in their living room to be able to say, we should all, that election was illegitimate, hydroxychloroquine will fight coronavirus or whatever. if we want that to be illegal, right? If we want it to be more like child sex abuse material and less like disfavored racist views that are odious and discredited, then that represents a kind of novel arrangement, an arrangement that actually like goes beyond even countries, at least sort of so-called liberal democracies that don't have the kind of fundamental First Amendment protections, but still have free speech protections. You know, in Canada, where I'm from, we don't have the First Amendment; we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's got a lot more nuance or flexibility or holes in it, depending on your point of view on what speech is allowed and what isn't. But even there, the stuff that's prohibited under the Charter, we don't try to police whether it's said in a living room, right, in a private space or in a private meeting, right? That it's still permissible. And if our goal is not just to create the social conditions in which ideas we dislike find a harder toehold rather, but if our goal is to actually make it so that no one utters a view we find odious, we're taking on board a really significant project that looks a lot more like, say, you know, the Shah of Iran's project than anything that we've ever done in a democratic country. I think it even goes beyond some of what Chinese censorship contemplates. It's a very extreme regime, and that's not my goal, right? Just to be clear, I don't think it's Daphne's goal either. But when the answer is, well, what do we do if people who have a space that we can't monitor say a thing that we don't like, as opposed to a thing that's illegal? If the answer isn't, well, we try to convince them somewhere else that that's a bad idea. If the answer is we find them and we stop them, then we're really on a path to a very different internet than I think most of us would be comfortable living in.
Can I say one thing in response to that, which is, you know, in my corner of academia and the law, there are 1,000 articles about the First Amendment speech right and this issue, and 0 about the right of assembly. And I think that's like a really important area that that we should be exploring more.
That's great. Great. Okay, great points there. So I want to turn us to the objections that Daphne raised, or the concerns that Daphne raised about interoperability. And I'm tempted to, well, let's just start with privacy. This seems like the biggest one, the one that where there's a lot of kind of fodder for discussion. And Corey, you've written about this problem extensively. You've thought about it a lot. Do you want to start off? You want to start by just responding to Daphne on this point and see where we go?
Yeah, I made some notes here as well. So I wrote a white paper. Actually, my colleague Bennett Cyphers wrote a white paper that I contributed to. He really deserves the credit, called "Privacy Without Monopoly." And when I'm done speaking, I'll find the link and paste it in the chat there. And it kind of gets into this in some depth. But I think Daphne put her finger on some really important points, right? Especially when she talked about Clearview and Creative Commons. You know, we are accustomed to this idea that this instrumental idea that if you don't have the policy that you need, oh, thank you, Alex. If you don't have the policy that you need to solve your problem, maybe you just grab another policy and see if you can make it work. We've seen a lot of this with copyright, as Daphne pointed out, that because we, for whatever reason, decided that we would treat the entire internet as though it should be regulated by entertainment law, we have this like powerful but really wildly unsuitable set of tools that we can use to do content removal and other kinds of interventions on bad speech, including bad speech that I think we could call objectively bad. You know, I remember in the early 2000s, as internet dating hit its like maybe its second bubble, I started to get emails from people who said, I'm surprised because you and I have been chatting on this dating service, and I went to the date that we set up and you weren't there. And I wasn't on the dating service, but someone else was, right, impersonating me. And I contacted the dating service and they said, we have a really easy solution to this. Just send a copyright takedown for your profile image and we'll remove your profile for copyright infringement. I was like, well, they're using first of all, they're using a photo I didn't take. So I would be committing perjury if I were to do that. But second of all, like leaving aside whether or not I want people impersonating me on a dating service, I have written dozens of books and I rely on copyright as a framework to negotiate the terms of my contracting with the industrial actors who pay my mortgage and will put my kid through school. And as someone who needs a robust set of rules that have broad social acceptance. I don't want to see copyright turned into this kind of nonsensical Swiss Army knife that we use for every purpose and that everyone comes to believe is an idiot's work, right? A dead letter. I need those rules to be intact and to be good and well thought of and in good odor. And, you know, what we've done over the last 40 years is stretch copyright so that it covers things that make copyright itself seem like a nonsense, such that it's become much harder for people who are actually aggrieved by copyright violations, like the writers that Disney is doing wage theft from, by claiming that when they bought Fox and other studios, they bought their assets, including the right to publish their books, but not their liabilities, which is the obligation to pay royalties on their books. That people just throw their hands up and go, oh, well, copyright's BS anyways. Why do we even listen to it? So, you know, you're right that Creative Commons does allow Clearview potentially to scrape images and use them to train facial recognition services. But the answer to that is not to create a copyright that allows you to decide not to have your face used in a facial recognition service. The answer to that, the thing that keeps copyright intact for people who need it, and that also addresses the privacy concerns, is to have rules about facial recognition. And that's why I favor this idea that if we had a privacy regulation, and you know, the contours of that privacy regulation are a thing that are difficult to get right, and we can see how there are real problems because the blended nature of claims over copyrighted information. I think it was Ed Felton who first wrote about this, where he said, you know, the conversion of personal information into a property right is going to be a disaster because their property rights need clear titles, and the title over personal information is very muddy. You know, do I own the fact that my mother is my mother, or does my mother own that fact? And what about my father? And if either of us or all three of us own that fact, then if you can buy the right to use that fact from my dad and I object to it, do I get a say in it, right? Felton said, like, we need to think about privacy as having interests and not as having property rights. And we can have valuable things that are regulated by overlapping interest. You know, babies are not property. People have overlapping claims to babies. If you were to make the argument that babies won't be truly valuable until we can buy and sell them like loaves of bread, you would be a monster. So maybe we need a set of sui generis privacy rights that take account of these overlapping interests. I don't think we can get them until such time as monopolism has been eroded, so that we can, the people who benefit from the confusion in privacy rights are no longer able to act as roadblocks with such efficacy. But I also think that, like, privacy rights are what we need, and not adjustments to copyright, not the paternalistic reliance on large firms to get it right. That what we need are democratically accountable privacy laws that take account of the specific contours of privacy.
But Daphne, before you jump in and respond, I'm sure you have a ton to say. I want to add one thing to that I'm hoping you can respond to. So Corey's answer in general terms is, the problem isn't interoperability, it's privacy. We can solve the privacy problem without throwing out interoperability as the potential solution that a lot of people are gravitating toward. And I imagine that one concern that a lot of people may have is, how easy is it to get these rules right, especially when you're talking about something as new and constantly evolving as social media. And I just want to point out a historical example where we don't have explicit rules, but we have become comfortable with this sort of data portability, and that's email. With a click of a button on most major email providers today, you can export all of your email from one to another. Nobody does a check to see whether the email service you're exporting to is a scrupulous email service that's not going to read the content of your email and exploit the very sensitive information you may have in there of your friends. You may have sensitive pictures of them, of their newborn kids, accounts of things that are going on in their lives that are extraordinarily sensitive. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure why the same conversation hasn't arisen around that kind of data portability, which seems, at least at first blush, to raise many of the same concerns of the problem as you described it, Daphne. You have my consent, but you don't have my friend's consent. Well, here that's true. When I exported my data from Gmail to Fastmail, I didn't ask my friends whether they consented to me exporting data to Fastmail. But maybe there's a sufficient culture around this, or we have sufficient expectations of email providers that they're not monkeying around with the emails. But again, we don't have a check to make sure you're not using an unscrupulous one. So I wonder if you can respond to that too. Does that suggest that there is some set of rules or expectations or norms that actually might be sufficient to give people comfort with exporting your friends' data too, and not just your own data?
Yeah, so it's a really good question and a really good example. I think part of the answer is with email. I'll start with the email thing and then come back to Corey's points. There's a little more of a social expectation that almost like sending a letter, like it is in the recipient's hands now and they might do other things with it, but like human things like forward it or disclose information from it, etc. With posts on something like Facebook, as I was actually just talking to Mike Masnick and some other people about this yesterday, there's a social expectation. So first of all, there's this really important point that like people don't post information on Facebook because they want Facebook to have it. They post information on Facebook because they want their friends to have it. And that is a good starting point for saying, and their friends, should have their proxy to do things that they would trust their friends to do, much as we effectively do with email. But on the other hand, maybe really our social expectation with Facebook isn't like email. It's more like, I think my friend is going to see this ephemerally and then forget it. And the idea that my friend might actually pull everything I ever said to them, hand it off to a third-party company, and that company will run AI over it and make conclusions about me. That was not part of the social expectation of, kind of what permissions I was granting my friend. So that's part of the answer. It's, as I said before, like, we need a bunch of smart people thinking about this. Just by no means the end of the answer. To Corey's points, so I reread the EFF paper yesterday in preparation for this, and I felt like the privacy issue, it kept being like, we're going to explain the answer to that a little later. Like it kept moving around, and I need to go back and like, it seemed like at the end of the day, the best case scenario was after the fact enforcement, was that third parties can come along and grab the data. And if they do something bad, then you have a right of action against them, but maybe it's too late and maybe they're outside the country and so forth. And like, maybe we're okay with that, but maybe we're not. Maybe if I don't want my data to be vulnerable to that, then I'm less likely to use any platform, not just Facebook, but some hypothetical platform that we like and trust. Maybe I want the platform I give my data to be my fiduciary and lock the data down and not let it be scraped. And maybe I want them to have a legal right to prevent scraping because in this case, it is in fact reflecting my intent as a user. So, maybe there's some way to restructure the laws on scraping that captures the like, this was the user's legitimate intent thing. But as I try to imagine that, I think what it turns into is Facebook has every user say, do you want us to let creepy people scrape this? Yes or no? And everybody ticks no. And Facebook's like, great, I'm your fiduciary now and I won't let anybody scrape this. So it's a very hard knot to unravel. And I think, just to go back to your point about not wanting to use legal tools the wrong way, abuse copyright, abuse anti-hacking laws, et cetera, to serve goals that are not the goals they were designed for. I totally agree with that. But I think we can try to, fix that problem, amend the CFAA, et cetera. And all we've done is, well, not all, it's really important. Like we've curbed an important source of abuse in the legal system, but we still haven't solved this problem about what to do to protect user privacy and what trade-offs to make to protect it more or less in exchange for other benefits.
Corey, any thoughts there? You got one of your buttons is unpushed.
Too many buttons. It's not a Zoom conference until someone's on mute. I think that Daphne makes a good point. So Bennett and I in our paper did not set out to describe what a good privacy regime was. What we set out to describe is, if you had a privacy regime, how would you make it enforceable on the internet? Because in truth, depending on the privacy regime you favor, much of it is going to be after the fact anyways, right? If Facebook says to someone, well, we're terminating your account because you've been making a list of everyone on Facebook who disagreed with you and publishing it on a web page of enemies of humanity, if you are judgment proof, you're still judgment proof, right? So the privacy rules are always going to involve a certain amount of after the fact enforcement, and very bad actors are going to be bad irrespective of their jurisdiction or what the laws say or whatever, right? I guess there are different ways of thinking about laws and regulations, whether they are there to tell the good people what's expected of them, or whether they're there to punish people who do bad things, or whether they're there to scare bad people off of doing bad things because they see what the punishment might be. And depending on your perspective, you might favor different outcomes here. But I would come back to the fact, as Daphne alluded to, that for so long as Facebook has the sole charge there, then you are reliant on their judgment. And so that works great if Facebook's interests are coterminal with yours. And it fails very badly when Facebook's interests are no longer coterminal with yours, because you may conclude that Facebook is in fact a very bad proxy for your privacy preferences, and still use Facebook and expose your private data to it, because the network effects are so important and the switching costs are so high that you are stuck in that mutual hostage taking situation. So I don't want to hand wave and say that everyone who can connect to Facebook will be good, or that there won't be after the fact enforcement challenges that involve people who are out of jurisdiction, or who are in some other way judgment proof. But I do want to say that I think that, as between all the different ways that this can go wrong, the one in which we hope that Mark Zuckerberg will be a wise God king for 2.6 billion people is the one that I think goes the wrongest. It's the one that we have the most historic evidence of going awry in some pretty important and often ghastly ways.
Great. There's so much that we could dig into on this subject. I do want to turn to content moderation, just so we can leave enough time to take questions from the audience, because we have a lot of really great ones, and I've been working on a few of them. But let's turn to content moderation for a second. Corey, I'd love to hear your response to Daphne's suggestion that one area in which having large firms is beneficial is in content moderation, because they can just do it a lot better. And I'm reminded by this argument of a paper that Evelyn Dueck wrote for the Knight Institute called Content Cartels, where she said, we see cartel-like behavior from the platforms when it comes to content moderation, and there are some benefits of that, but we need to make sure that those arrangements are transparent and reflect democratic norms and processes. What do you make of that? And Daphne, to you, do you think the problem of content moderation is not as high stakes in an interoperable social media environment because of the putative benefits of interoperability and heterogeneity to the speech environment? In other words, would having an interoperable speech environment ameliorate enough some of the concerns around the viral spread of hate speech, harassment, extremist content, et cetera, that we'd be okay with not being, with each node in the network not being quite as good at content moderation as Facebook can be with its enormous treasure and labor? So I don't know who wants to go first, but yeah, Corey.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that it's a double-edged sword, the cartel-like behavior. On the one hand, where there's stuff that's unambiguously unlawful, then having a cooperative venture that does things like fingerprinting is not a terrible least worst solution. We're talking about CSAM. Then having a bunch of fingerprints of things that you should block at your gateway makes sense. But we also know that allowing private actors to assemble that without oversight and without some kind of way to push back can create an opportunity for enormous mischief. I'm reminded of when WikiLeaks published the CSAM block lists of, I believe, the Swedish and Danish telcos, and found that something like 99.5% of the stuff in that block list was not CSAM nor CSAM adjacent. It just became a place where you could shovel stuff that you didn't like, and because no one wanted to look and see what was at the other end of those URLs, because the thing that those URLs represented was something so terrible. that you could just put things like gambling sites and assisted suicide sites and just other stuff in there. But if you can form a co-op of people who trust each other, that's fine, and there's no reason that that has to be limited to just the large actors. As to the rest of it, I think that what matters more than what you could pull into your federated instance of diaspora that talks to Facebook is what you do pull in, right? What your users actually see. And this is where having smaller communities who are closer to their moderators, who can make rules that have fewer unanticipated failure modes, can represents a possibility to do something that's far more nuanced than Facebook can, but at the same time will fail in different ways than Facebook does, that will be maybe less comprehensive because there are fewer people working on that problem. But I'm minded over the last year of how much of our vocabulary choices, our common terminologies, what subjects we can and can't bring up, what is and is not in scope for a group. Think of tech startups that have imploded after saying this is a tech workplace, not a place where we talk about whether Black Lives Matter. That those are like evolving standards, and that people within communities might contest the rules even after the rules are set. And that we don't really want a regime in which we all make a suicide pact and we say, okay, everybody in this group uses the following terms and never uses these other terms, and if it shows up, we want it blocked. What you want is a process of humane normative negotiation among the stakeholders in the group that reflects when they want to see things blocked and when they don't. There are communities where racial slurs that refer to themselves can be used in discussing instances in which they have undergone traumatic incidents. And then there are communities similarly constituted ones where they say, look, I just, even if someone called you the N-word, I don't want to read the N-word, right? And it's up to each of those groups to make their own calls, and not the place for a content moderator who isn't part of that group to make that call. And so I think that, given that the volume will be lower and the group size will be more intimate, that the salience of getting it wrong is less important, and the possibility to get it right in ways Facebook can't is exciting enough that we should be willing to try it.
So I'll jump in on this question about whether content moderation might just not be so high stakes because of the benefits of interoperability. I think part of the answer is yes. Like if what we're worried about is virality and amplification and, et cetera, then having a bunch of little nodes with their own rules, that tamps that down quite a bit. Beyond that, does the problem go away? Maybe, kind of. It depends what the nodes look like. I know that Ethan has talked about and is working on groups for very small local political discussions that have like 3,000 or 5,000 members, and they're all there for the same reason. And there just isn't that much inbound content or abuse. And there isn't that much need for content moderation. That's part of this picture, and a wonderful part of this picture. But another part is some ambitious tech bros with funding who want to be a competitor to challenge Facebook and want to be high volume. And we want them to do that, I think, but they can't afford to staff up yet for content moderation. I do think we want to think about and try to solve for that set of potential nodes also, in a way that avoids the content cartel problems that, as you said, Evelyn Dueck has written about so well. Another question to think about is, where does spam go in this world? If you are a real spammer, you're sending out high volume, misleading, commercial, scammy content, what does that adversarial set of actors start doing in the distributed world, and who responds to it and how and pays for the response? And I'm not quite sure how that works. And then a last piece is just to beware of the fantasy of the distributed web, or the fantasy of peer-to-peer network freedom, because we just know that part of what happens on networks that don't have policing is people show up and are distributing child sexual abuse material. There is genuine bad stuff there that you need some way to respond to. Also, people show up and start sharing pirated movies, and that is both bad and brings down the wrath of Hollywood and the legal power for lawsuits and the policy team power for changing laws. Like we can't pretend those issues don't exist because they have sunk efforts like this in the past and have to be navigated.
So can I pick up right there? And Corey, I see you kind of nodding your head. This makes me wonder how the current experiments are going. And Edward Platt in the Q&A asked a question relating to this. How are the smaller platforms handling these sorts of issues right now? So Wikipedia, for example, you might think of as a smaller social platform with its own kind of governance structure and moderation guidelines. You might think of each kind of subreddit as having its own community, governance that has to deal with some of these issues. It obviously also has its overriding one from Reddit itself. There's Mastodon, which has different instances. How has Mastodon been dealing with some of these content moderation questions? And then Edward Platt in his question asks about a few others. I'm not sure whether these are protocols or actual instances of distributed networks, but ActivityPub and Diaspora. Any empirical evidence so far?
I'm not sure. Corey?
I don't know of any either. I was going to say that we do have analogies to the spam problem and other problems like this in the federated world. The examples are complicated and not perfect. But if you think about the relationship that various telcos have to one another across national boundaries, and how those relationships involve a minimum set of standards for things like crime and lawful interception and so on, and how there are kind of very severe penalties that are rarely invoked against a national carrier, and then there are less severe penalties. But every now and again, some Caribbean island will cooperate with some US-based scammers to let them make ghost calls to your phone where it rings once and then hangs up. And if you call them back, they'll have set the long distance tariff for a call from the US at $40 for the first minute. And they just say, sorry, I don't know what you're calling about, and hang up. And then you get a $40 bill, and $39 of that goes to the scammer, right? And when that happens, and we see a lot of it and the carrier won't do anything about it, sometimes, your national carriers will just sever relationships with that island. And, that tends to change the behavior pretty quickly. And it doesn't take all of them to do it. And there are probably instances in which it's not good, right? There are probably instances in which that penalty can be invoked in ways that don't reflect, obviously bad behavior, and might just be, we're cutting you off because, you're a Gulenist, or because you talk about Uyghur genocide or whatever. That's not a problem that we don't see in the real world already, and it's not a problem that we don't have some mechanisms for addressing in the real world.
Okay, I want to pull in another audience question. And this one goes to a concern that Daphne raised at some point, but we haven't picked up on it since. And the question's from George McCrae. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. And he writes, the core question is this economically feasible given the way internet business has developed? Which I take to be a riff on Daphne's observation at the outset, that the success of this will depend on whether we can figure out how to get the ad incentives right, assuming that an ad model is an inevitable one. Corey, do you have a kind of response to Daphne's articulation of that concern?
Well, I think that I don't know that George, who I think goes by Gamok, actually online, is raising that question. Obviously, like, the more content, there's a relationship with content moderation and users, and we're not sure to what extent it's like linear or there's a tipping point or whatever. I'd love to see some empirical data on that. I think one of the ways we can find out whether large communities require large numbers of moderators, or whether there's a threshold beyond which moderation can take place, or whether we can see federation within moderation. One of the ways to find out is to try it. We haven't had much experience with stuff beyond a kind of chaotic early period, and then a lot of consolidation driven by anti-competitive mergers. But the thing that in terms of contemporary business models that I think we probably don't want to support is some elements of the advertising driven ecosystem. So if you read the Competition and Market Authority report, one of the things that is very surprising to me in that report is they identify a competitive problem because only Facebook and Google spy on you enough to do something called attribution, which is where they show you an ad and then they follow you around forever to see if you do anything that might be attributable to what you saw in that ad, right? Did you walk into a store because they're harvesting your location data? Did you buy something because they're harvesting your credit card data, and so on? And they say, well, we need some competition here because the advertising industry requires attribution to make good advertising allocations. And I think that actually the proper policy response is that attribution is incredibly creepy and we should exterminate it. And it's true that if you're double-digit year-on-year growth and high margins that we see from the ad tech duopoly are to be sustained, then we probably have to continue to support attribution as part of the market. The reason advertisers are willing to pay over the odds is not just that there's a monopoly, but that monopoly can give them this service. I think we should exterminate that service. I think firms should accept lower margins. I think capital that's invested into doing this is capital that's been misallocated from a social perspective. I think the government should intervene in that market to make sure that it stops existing. I think that market shouldn't have existed in the first place. So in that sense, I think it is completely incompatible with contemporary business internet business models. I want it to be. I want interoperability to be incompatible with that business model. I want that internet business model to stop existing. I don't want what the CMA proposes, which is that maybe their new regulator can assign everyone a permanent government issued advertising tracking ID so that we can have competition and mass surveillance. I think that is like the worst possible answer to this problem.
Daphne, any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, just some brief ones. So I think Corey rightly addressed both sides of the question. One is the cost side, and I focused on the cost of moderation, but there's also the cost of everything else about running a node or a business, including building adequate security so that the weak security of the competitors doesn't become a reason to stay with the incumbents because they have bigger security engineering teams. So that there's this cost side, and then there's the revenue side. And one, I am not an ad tech expert, but like one answer is tear it down. Don't have it anymore, or at least don't have some parts of it anymore, and rethink the whole thing of how internet companies make money. That sounds good, but it sounds really big. It's another really big project to solve. And then another way to come at it is to say, okay, leave it up. And this is already a business that's used to distributing fractions of pennies to weird players throughout the ecosystem. Let them distribute more fractions of pennies to the new players that were introduced, the competitors, the new players that we're introducing. There's a problem there too, as I saw Dina Srinivasan, who's one of the attorneys suing my former employer, Google, on an antitrust claim, talking about this on a panel recently. And she was talking about how the players in the ad tech system do all of this, complicated, fast, high volume, instantaneous stuff that is very comparable to what finance companies do, but is not regulated in the way that the finance industry is. And so the barriers to like self-dealing and what would be insider trading in another, all of those things are not in place. And so I think there's going to be a problem if you bring along the new competitors and they're supposed to get their fractions of the pennies, but you haven't solved the problem of ad tech. Even if you leave it intact, you haven't solved that problem. Then that's a problem that you haven't solved. So, this is why I list this as a difficult thing to deal with, and then I kind of try to hand it off to someone else.
Great. So we're actually at time, but I want to, unless Ethan breaks in and tells me we need to stop now, I want to ask one final question to you all, just so you can land with a note of hope, hopefully. And I apologize to members of the audience for the many questions that I didn't get a chance to ask. But that you asked, and I hope you'll continue the conversation in the threads or in, on Twitter. And if you do, use the conference hashtag Reimagine, and we'll do our best to answer there. But for people who are interested in interoperability as a possible alternative vision of the internet or of social media platforms, what's the next step? What do we do next to make this vision a reality? Are there small steps we can take? Anything from supporting Twitter's Blue Sky effort, which we haven't really talked about, but in passing today, is that something that's worth supporting? And this is, Jack Dorsey's announcement that they would explore the possibility of an open and interoperable social media protocol, and with Twitter being the first client of this user of this new protocol. Is that something worth supporting? Is there a kind of a law that is standing in the way of all of this that we need to tackle first? Corey, you mentioned some. Is that the first step, or are there others? Give us a reason for optimism at the end of the panel.
I'll go first. I mean, I think that I've been kind of the lawyer naysayer role on this panel, but the big problems that I described are things I think talented technologists can solve, working with people who are thinking big picture about the values here and the laws. So, I think if there were a bunch of those people trying to figure out how we negotiate this privacy problem, we would come to better options than we have today. Ditto the cost of content moderation problem. And they're just, as far as I know, there haven't been people who are motivated to step up and be like, I'm going to own this project and really drive it. And, but maybe those people are in this room. Step up, do it. This is such an amazing way forward, and it is really worth all the tire kicking and all of the talent and effort that we can put into it.
So I think that some of what we face in the online pathology of concentrated platforms is novel and unforeseeable, right? There are definitely problems that are weird enough that I can be a science fiction writer in the 21st century and never run out of ideas. But I think a lot of the problems that we have are completely foreseeable. We should have headed them off. We didn't because we couldn't muster the political will. And a good part of why we couldn't muster the political will was not because lawmakers are old and clueless. Not very few of our members of Congress are water experts, and we're not all dead of giardia. We're capable of making laws that our lawmakers don't have the technical background to understand by having expert agencies that, adjudicate, contradictory claims and come up with good policy regulations. And the reason we didn't head those problems off is because, we have a system that has been corrupted by monopoly, and it's not unique to tech. We have a system, I alluded to pharma. We have a system that has been corrupted by monopoly in lots of ways, in our transit policy, and the fact that we have big four accounting firms that are, routinely embroiled in horrific corruption scandals that, just over and over again in every sector, there are huge problems of monopoly and policy. And though that might sound pessimistic, I'm going to tell you why I think it's optimistic. It's optimistic because of the point that James Boyle makes when he talks about the origins of the ecology movement. And he says that before the term ecology came along, all you had were issues, and it wasn't clear how they were related. If you care about owls and I care about the ozone layer, why are we on the same side? I'm interested in the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere, and you care about charismatic nocturnal birds, right? We are not on the same side. A Martian looking through a telescope couldn't tell you that we would be on the same side. And the term competition welded together 15,000 issues, or not competition, ecology welded 15,000 issues together into a movement that was able to fight each other's corners, right? I'm still the ozone guy and you're still the owl person, right? But we are fighting each other's backs now. We have each other's back. And monopoly right now is an issue for people in lots of ways, in ways that go beyond the degradation of the internet into 4 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 3. If you're worried that 2 companies own all the beer you drink, or that Vince McMahon bought all the other wrestling leagues and your favorite wrestlers are on GoFundMe begging for pennies to die with dignity in their 50s of their workplace related injuries because he reclassified them as contractors and took away their health insurance, or if you're angry that there's only one eyeglass maker in the world and they own every retailer, you might think that you're worried about eyeglasses or wrestling or beer or the big 4 accounting firms, but really you're pissed off about monopoly. And so we're on the verge of taking those 1,000 issues and welding them into one giant movement, a movement with real political power because of all the areas of our lives that it touches. And tech is the right place to start because, although all industries ended up monopolistic through the same factors, they all, bought their way into monopoly, they can be unwound in their own ways. The technical characteristics of digital technology make it particularly amenable to demonopolization because we can have these partial solutions, right? Rather than going for the breakup and 12 years in antitrust hell like IBM faced, we can settle and we can settle with the requirement that you take on a special master that says you're not allowed to block interoperators. And that gets you a solution pretty quickly that then creates stakeholders for more aggressive action that can lead to the breakups that we will ultimately need in big tech. And so, this is the right place to start. And we have a lot of people who will fight for it. And the tech industry is in pretty moment. There are very few people who step up to defend it. So there's lots of people who will fight with you to make, who love tech but hate the industry, and who will fight to make the industry a better one through demonopolization. And that's the right place to be, right? We have a place we can go. We have people who fight with us, and we have a way to turn that into deep structural change across multiple sectors.
With that note of hope, thank you both. Thank you to everyone for joining. We have 2 great panels tomorrow. You can find the details at knightcolumbia.org and in the chat. And we have the final panel on Friday. And thank you.
Thanks for having us.